A few brief remarks. And mine is to put this whole debate in the context of where we are in South Africa. I speak here as a citizen of this country who, in my pastoral visits, I visit people from the Super Shack in Langa to Kwanongoma in deep rural Zululand. And one of the things that impresses me most, especially with the mothers, is that they have a resolve to educate their children. But the disadvantage is there. Mothers will wake up very early in the mornings. By the time we wake up in our houses, they are there to scrub our floors, and they put those few pennies for their children. I'm here too, as a person who is involved in the restoration of historic schools. These are the schools which were run by the churches, which produced leaders of integrity and caliber in this country. Had apartheid not destroyed those schools, we wouldn't be here today discussing about this. I'm here as a person who visits the schools and sees the amount of destruction and looking the pupils in their eyes, wanting the best of their education. Why should we debar children of parents trapped in the cycle of poverty with no access to proper education? And yet, in spite of where the schools are, the students still strive and get good marks and want to come to universities like this. And remember the words of Nelson Mandela, that education is one instrument that can make a child of a peasant become a doctor. And so, in terms of the context where we are, we have to recognize that people who are disadvantaged, most are people who are black like me, who have got no access to resources, and yet strive to want the best for their children. And for me, the solution is one, that we must stiffen our spines and march to Parliament, knock at the doors of government, and say we want an education system in this country that prepares for the future of our country, where all our children would come to universities like this because of merit. Now, that's a long haul, because we have got to start from grade R into matric. We're talking about 20 years to 30 years. And so that's where our efforts should be directed. But in the meantime, we should do our best to make sure that those children of mothers and fathers who want the best for their children have access to universities such as this one. I thank you.
Can I start with you, Max? The thrust of a lot of the criticism is that you're using an untransformed category of race. It came through in what Neville suggested, it comes through in what David Benatar suggests, that you're using an apartheid categorization, an untransformed view of the world, to institute some form of restitution. And that what you therefore do is you can never get to a non-racial society by asking people to position themselves and categorize themselves in precisely the way apartheid did. Now, how do you respond to that?
The criticism is correct. I don't think it's a criticism, though. I think the whole point of redress is to redress along the lines of inequality and of the society that creates
Then why don't we deal with inequality and call a spade a spade?
So it was because...
It's so hard to define class in this country, it doesn't seem to me.
Okay, that's a different question. About
no,
whether,
it's not a different question.
Whether we can define quality, but whether the categories we use to define people are the apartheid categories. I'm saying yes, they are the apartheid categories. I'm not denying that. And I'm saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not trying to get out of that. I'm saying that's not a criticism. That was the basis of inequality. And if we accept, and we can come back to the technical question of why we have to use the proxy, but if we're using a proxy, it seems to me that the right proxy to use is precisely to say, how would you have been classified under apartheid? I don't think that's such an embarrassing question. I don't think it's a hard question to answer. Most of us can answer the question. And knowing how you would have been classified tells you a lot about your social circumstances, what you've inherited, what your opportunities are, and therefore what has to be redressed.
But could I just ask you on that? It's not just a question of saying how you would have been classified. You carry that onward, and then you reproduce a categorization into the future.
Right.
So that you can never get to this non-racial society. You can't ever get to the image of the society prefigured in what Neville Alexander was talking about.
Of course, as we've said, it's for now, but your point is, and their point is, isn't it dangerous to the point that it will create a society that views the world through such permanent racial lenses that we cannot think outside the racial box?
That's precisely what I'm putting to you.
And I would like to present to you the alternative, which is this, that in 2017, when this year's medical students graduate, in the absence of a race-defined policy, we would have 25% of our graduates black. 24 years after apartheid has ended, we would produce a class of medical graduates that is 25% black, 75% white. Now, I think that you can't stop people from seeing the world in black and white just because you stop using the labels. What people will see is a world where inequality remains, in fact, not just de jure, in fact, divided along the categories that were the apartheid race categories. I think the threat to our society in the future of having that inequality defined so clearly along the old apartheid lines is a much greater threat than the threat of a potential Rwanda because we've continued to use race labels. I'm not afraid of the race labels for the next while. I think we can counter it. I think a society where 50, 60, 70% of our leaders are what in apartheid years were called black and has required us to use those labels to get there is a much healthier and safer society for all of us than a society where 80, 90% of people who were defined black under apartheid remain poor and living in shacks.
I want to put that to Neville Alexander and the others, but just one final point to you. What happens if people refuse to classify themselves? They simply say it's obscene. We're in a non-racial society and we don't regard ourselves as anything other than members of humanity.
No, of course they're free to do that.
And then what happens then?
And then they get, in terms of the admissions policy, we have a category called other, and they basically get treated as white. In other words, anyone who doesn't want to classify themselves...
That's extraordinary. In order to privilege myself, I have to say I'm black.
Yeah, because
and if I come from a township and I say I'm amazed that I'm here. You can see from my school where I came from. You can see my background and everything, but I'm not prepared to classify myself. I'm classified as white.
Yes, you're classified as other because the affirmative action policy only applies to people who are black or classify themselves as black. There's no affirmative action policy for white or people who don't want to classify themselves.
Yes,
so
but these are black people who just want to classify as white. I mean, this shows the tenuous categorization problem, does it not?
You can't, on the one hand, want to benefit from an affirmative action policy and on the other hand say you're not willing to classify yourself in order to benefit from it.
We'll come back from the benefits in a moment. I know you're desperate to talk, Neville, but I have to ask you this. In fairness, because if we're going to have this debate, it's got to be fair. And the real question on the other side is, if we were not to do anything, which is what I think Max Price is saying, then we'd have a university which would be as pristinely white as the one that confronted me when I arrived here as a first-year student, and would continue to be the case. And that's just not on. And none of our institutions can continue to reproduce that, even if the reason for that is an outrageous education policy, which, as the Archbishop says, continues to this day. So some measure to address the past has to take place, and he's saying the best we've got at the moment, as imperfect as is race. Now, what's wrong with that?
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciated that you want to cast the debate in your terms.
No. I'm not. I'm merely... that's Max's term, and you're entitled to respond to it in your term.
No, quite. But you must allow me to say a few things, which I'll come to your point in a second. I won't be long.
As long as you answer, it's not going away, the question.
No, certainly not. No. The first point, I think, to make is that affirmative action only touches a tiny minority of South Africans. To be affirmed, you've got to have comparable skills, knowledge, etc. Otherwise, there's no point to it. for the vast majority of South Africans, what we're talking about is transformation measures.
Mm-hmm.
Building homes, giving them jobs, etc., etc. And as the Archbishop said, making sure that from grade R to grade 12 they get a decent education, so that by the time they get to apply to go to university or to vocational college or wherever else, they have been empowered. So we're talking about a very small group of people, and therefore it's in some sense it's a peripheral question. If you go to KwaZulu-Natal, into what somebody, I think it was the Archbishop said, deep rural Zululand, you will probably find only people labeled black. Does this mean that it's not a non-racial
No, but hang on, mate.
setup? No,
Universities, but you've got
but
we're talking about universities here, and they are inherently a small population.
I'm coming to
You're trying to broaden the debate into things that Max Price is not talking about. It's not fair to him.
As I said in my initial input,
Right.
we're not talking simply about technical issues about how do you classify or not classify. We're talking about an entire society, and if you're going to ask the wrong questions, you're going to get the wrong answer.
Well, well, to quote you, it depends on the perspective of which question. You may not like my question, doesn't make it wrong.
Your question leaves me cold, to be quite frank.
Doesn't matter.
The point I want to make is a very, very simple point.
Yeah.
The demographic reality of South Africa, the vast majority of people are people who are labeled black.
Yes.
Within 1 to 1.5 generations, every institution in this country will be representative in the sense in which the Employment Equity Act refers to it. Even if you do nothing, I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything. On the contrary, because, and I always make the point, and people are, people don't like to hear this. We are involved in affirmative action because the revolution failed. Let's face it. If the revolution had succeeded, we would have confiscated all the damn property in the country. And we would have made blooming sure that people were empowered, that they were affirmed, that they were educated properly, etc. The reason
But not in 16 years. It would have taken longer than that. You yourself said so when we last had the debate. This is a long process. And you accused affirmative action proponents last time round of actually trying to fast forward a problem, an easy fix to a serious structural problem.
That's what I want to come to. You see, I believe really firmly that there are a number of things that we must face and speak about, candidly. We are South Africans. We have an open debate about race. You go to Cuba, you go to Brazil, you won't see this. This is one of the reasons why this is a land of good hope. The fact that we can speak openly about these things. But then we must be candid. For example, so-called whites in South Africa are South Africans. They're not foreigners. And if the majority of blooming medical students are white, so what? For the next 10 or 15 years. So what? They're South Africans. The white capitalist class is a South African capitalist class. It's not a foreign capitalist class. I'm being deliberately provocative. I want to show you.
I can see that.